On April 8, 1943, high above occupied France, German fighter pilots spotted something unusual climbing toward them through the thin, freezing air. At first glance, it hardly looked like a threat. It was bulky, oversized, almost awkward in its proportions. Its fuselage appeared too thick, its wings too heavy. Compared to the sleek, predatory lines of the Messerschmitt Bf 109 or the Focke-Wulf 190, it seemed clumsy, like a machine that did not belong in the sky at all. The morning itself was cold and clear, the kind of high-altitude visibility that favored interception. Contrails streaked the sky in long white scars, marking the passage of bombers and their escorts. Below, France lay under occupation, its rail lines feeding the German war machine, its factories contributing to a conflict that had consumed an entire continent. Columns of smoke from industrial centers drifted upward, merging with the haze of war that now permanently hovered over Europe. Over the radio, some of them laughed. They called it a flying milk bottle. To the seasoned veterans of the Luftwaffe, men who had carved their reputations over Poland, France, and the Soviet Union, it looked like an easy kill. These were pilots hardened by years of combat, many already aces with dozens of victories. They had faced British Spitfires and Hurricanes during the Battle of Britain, Soviet Yak and Lei-GG fighters over the Eastern Front. And they knew how to exploit weaknesses in any opponent. They understood energy, positioning, timing, and this new American aircraft, slow to turn and massive in size, seemed full of vulnerabilities. They had been trained in a doctrine that emphasized aggression and initiative. German fighter tactics prioritized striking first, maintaining advantage, and disengaging on favorable terms. Against most opponents, this had worked. And now, as they looked at this unfamiliar American machine, they assumed it would be no different. But what they were seeing in that moment was not a failure of design. It was the beginning of something they did not yet understand. Within 18 months, those same skies over Europe would belong to that aircraft. The laughter would disappear. In its place would come hesitation, then caution, and finally fear. German pilots would begin to avoid it, to respect it, and ultimately to dread the sound of its approach. Not just as an aircraft, but as a symbol of something much larger. Because that flying milk bottle was the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. This is the story of how one of the most unlikely fighters of the Second World War, dismissed, doubted, and nearly abandoned, became one of the most destructive weapons in the Allied arsenal. It is a story not just of engineering, but of philosophy. Not just of pilots, but of industry. It is the story of brute force against finesse, of overwhelming power against refined skill, and of how, in the end, a war in the skies was not won by elegance, but by endurance, firepower, and the relentless weight of production. The origins of the P-47 Thunderbolt can be traced back to a moment of crisis, one that shook military planners in the United States to their core. In 1940, the fall of France sent shockwaves across the Atlantic. In a matter of weeks, the German Wehrmacht had dismantled what was considered one of the most powerful armies in Europe. But perhaps even more alarming than the speed of the ground campaign was the dominance of the Luftwaffe. German aircraft had swept through the skies with terrifying efficiency. They had coordinated closely with ground forces, neutralized enemy airfields, and destroyed resistance before it could organize. For American observers, the lesson was clear. Air superiority was no longer optional. It was decisive. The political implications of this realization were profound. In Washington, debates intensified over the role the United States would play in the conflict. Officially neutral, the country was nonetheless moving steadily toward involvement. Programs like Lend-Lease began supplying Allied nations with equipment, while American industry quietly shifted toward wartime production. President Franklin D. Roosevelt faced the delicate challenge of preparing a nation for war while navigating strong isolationist sentiment at home. Across Washington, military committees and planners began reassessing assumptions that had guided American air doctrine since the interwar years. There had been a lingering belief that geography, the vast oceans separating the United States from Europe and Asia, would provide time to prepare. That illusion collapsed with the rapid fall of Western Europe. If war came, it would not be distant for long. At that time, American fighter design still leaned toward lighter, more maneuverable aircraft. There was an emphasis on agility, on dogfighting performance. But the events unfolding in Europe suggested that this approach might not be enough, especially in a war that would increasingly be fought at high altitude, escorting bombers deep into enemy territory. At the same time, a broader strategic debate was unfolding within the US Army Air Corps. Some believed that long-range bombers alone could win the war by striking industrial targets. Others argued that without proper fighter escort, those bombers would suffer unacceptable losses. The experiences of the Royal Air Force during the early years of the war, particularly the heavy losses during daylight bombing raids, served as a warning. It was in this context that Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian-born engineer working for Republic Aviation, began to push for something radically different. Kartveli himself had lived through upheaval. Born in the Russian Empire, he had witnessed revolution and displacement before eventually building a career in aviation in the United States. His perspective was shaped not only by engineering principles, but by a broader understanding of conflict and survival. He approached aircraft design not as an art of balance, but as a question of dominance. Kartveli did not believe in designing a fighter that could outturn its enemies. Instead, he envisioned an aircraft that could outlast them, outgun them, and outrun them in the vertical plane. His concept was built around a simple but bold idea. If you cannot outmaneuver your opponent, you can overwhelm them with power. This philosophy was not universally accepted. Many within the aviation community still believed that maneuverability was the essence of fighter combat. Kartveli's proposal seemed to reject that tradition entirely. But the urgency of war allowed for bold experimentation. The result was the XP-47B prototype. From the very beginning, it defied expectations. It was enormous for a single-engine fighter, weighing nearly twice as much as some of its contemporaries. At its heart was a massive Pratt & Whitney R2-800 double wasp radial engine, capable of producing extraordinary horsepower. But what truly set it apart was its turbo supercharger system, which allowed it to maintain performance at high altitudes where other aircraft began to struggle. This turbo supercharger was not merely an addition, it defined the aircraft's architecture. Ducting ran through the fuselage, channeling exhaust gases to drive the turbine. The design was complex, heavy, and required careful engineering to function reliably. But the payoff was immense. This came at a cost. The aircraft was complex, heavy, and difficult to handle. Many engineers questioned whether it was practical. Pilots who first encountered it were skeptical, even alarmed. It did not feel like a traditional fighter. But when it climbed, it revealed its potential. At altitude, the XP-47B could achieve speeds and performance levels that were almost unheard of at the time. It was stable in a dive, incredibly fast in the vertical, and capable of carrying more firepower than any American fighter before it. Still, doubts remained. As the United States entered the war in December 1941, the P-47, now moving into production, was far from a proven weapon. It was, in many ways, an experiment on a massive scale. And for the men who would be asked to fly it, that experiment came with deadly consequences. By 1942, the first operational units equipped with the P-47 began to form, among them the 56th Fighter Group under the command of Hubert Zemke. Zemke was not only a skilled pilot, but also a forward-thinking leader who understood that new aircraft required new tactics. But before tactics could be developed, pilots had to survive the machine itself. The Thunderbolt quickly earned a reputation as a dangerous aircraft to fly, at least for those unprepared for its unique characteristics. Its sheer size and power introduced challenges that many pilots had never encountered before. Torque from the massive engine could cause violent roll tendencies during takeoff. Its weight made landings unforgiving. And at high speeds, especially in dives, pilots encountered a phenomenon that was not yet fully understood: compressibility. Aircraft would become unresponsive, controls would stiffen, and pilots found themselves plunging toward the Earth with little ability to recover. This phenomenon forced engineers and pilots alike into a race against time to understand the physics of high-speed flight. The P-47, unintentionally, became one of the aircraft that pushed aviation into the edge of the transonic regime. Lessons learned from these dangerous experiences would later shape jet aircraft development and influence post-war aviation research programs. Accidents were frequent. In fact, during this early period, more pilots were lost in training than in combat. Confidence in the aircraft was low. Many viewed it as a flawed design. Too heavy, too complicated, too dangerous. There was also a deeper issue. The P-47 did not behave like the fighters pilots had been, trained to fly. It could not compete in tight turning engagements with German aircraft. In a traditional dogfight, it was at a disadvantage. For pilots accustomed to thinking of aerial combat as a test of maneuverability, this was a serious problem. Frustration grew. Some questioned whether the aircraft had been a mistake. But slowly a realization began to take hold. This was not a dogfighter. It was something else entirely. It represented a shift in thinking, from individual combat to systemic warfare, from agility to survivability, from pilot instinct to engineered advantage. By the spring of 1943, the P-47 was deployed over Europe and its pilots were about to face the true test of combat. Their first encounters with the Luftwaffe were sobering. German pilots, many of them veterans with years of experience, quickly identified the Thunderbolt's weaknesses. They engaged in turning fights, drawing the American pilots into situations where the P-47's weight and slower. Roll rate put them at a disadvantage. Losses followed. The early missions over occupied France revealed just how unprepared the Americans were for this type of combat. Coordination was lacking, tactics were still evolving, and the pilots themselves were still learning how to use their aircraft effectively. The Royal Air Force, observing these engagements, was openly critical. To them, the P-47 seemed inferior to the Spitfire in almost every way that mattered in a dogfight. The German pilots, meanwhile, remained confident. They continued to mock the aircraft. But something unusual began to emerge. Despite taking heavy damage in combat, many P-47s were returning to base. Pilots reported aircraft riddled with bullet holes, engines damaged, control surfaces compromised, yet still flying. This was not normal. Gradually, attention shifted from what the Thunderbolt could not do to what it could endure. Its radial engine, unlike the liquid-cooled engines of many fighters, was far more resistant to damage. It could absorb hits that would have crippled other aircraft. The airframe itself was heavily built with armor plating protecting the pilot and critical systems. And then there was its armament. 8.50 caliber machine guns mounted in the wings, capable of delivering an unprecedented volume of fire. Unlike the cannon-based weapons used by German fighters, which relied on fewer, more powerful shots, the Thunderbolt's guns created a continuous stream of destruction. When they hit, they did not just damage, they shredded. These qualities began to change the way pilots thought about the aircraft. It was not meant to dance in the sky. It was meant to survive, strike, and escape. This shift in understanding was accelerated by a single, extraordinary event in June 1943. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group found himself alone over France after a mission. His aircraft had already sustained damage when he was attacked by a German fighter. What followed was a prolonged and brutal encounter. Johnson's P-47 was hit repeatedly. His canopy shattered, leaving him exposed to the freezing air. His systems began to fail. Fuel leaked. Control surfaces were damaged. He himself was wounded. Yet the aircraft kept flying. The German pilot, likely expecting the Thunderbolt to go down after the first few passes, continued to attack. Again and again, he fired, closing in, attempting to finish the kill. But the P-47 refused to die. At one point, the German pilot flew close enough to see the extent of the damage and the fact that Johnson was still alive. Running low on ammunition, he made one final pass. Then, in a moment that has since become part of aviation legend, he pulled alongside, looked at Johnson, and saluted. Then he broke away. Johnson managed to return to base and land his aircraft, an aircraft that, upon inspection, appeared barely capable of flight. The story spread quickly. Among American pilots, it became a symbol of the Thunderbolt's resilience. Among German pilots, it raised uncomfortable questions. What kind of aircraft could absorb that level of punishment and still return home? The answer would become increasingly clear as the war continued. Under the leadership of Hubert Zemke, the 56th Fighter Group began to refine a new approach to aerial combat, one that would unlock the true potential of the P-47. They abandoned the idea of dogfighting. Instead, they embraced what would become known as boom and zoom tactics. Using the Thunderbolt's excellent high-altitude performance and dive speed, pilots would attack from above, using gravity and engine power to build speed. They would strike quickly, delivering devastating firepower, and then use that speed to disengage, climbing back to altitude for another pass. This doctrine aligned closely with broader changes in American air strategy. Rather than seeking individual duels in the sky, US fighter groups began to operate as coordinated units, prioritizing mission success over personal victory counts. Discipline replaced improvisation. It was a method that played to every strength of the aircraft. And it worked. Pilots like Robert Johnson, Francis Gabreski, and Walker Mahurin began to achieve success. Victories increased, confidence returned. The Thunderbolt was no longer seen as a liability. It was becoming a weapon. This transformation was put to the test during the strategic bombing campaigns of 1943, particularly during the missions to Schweinfurt and Regensburg. These were deep penetration raids into Germany, targeting critical industrial infrastructure. The bombers, B-17 flying fortresses, required escort, and the P-47 was one of the primary fighters assigned to the task. But there was a problem: range. At this stage, the P-47 could not accompany the bombers all the way to their targets. This left the bombers vulnerable during the most dangerous parts of the mission. German forces exploited this. They deployed heavily armed aircraft, including Bf-110s, designed to attack bombers with concentrated firepower. When these aircraft encountered P-47 escorts, the results were often catastrophic for the Germans. The Thunderbolt's 8 machine guns proved devastating against larger, less maneuverable targets. German aircraft were torn apart in mid-air, sometimes disintegrating under the sustained barrage. For the first time, German pilots began to experience the full destructive potential of the P-47. At high altitude, the Thunderbolt held another advantage. Its turbo-supercharger allowed it to maintain performance where German fighters began to struggle. Above 25,000 feet, the balance began to shift. This shift had deadly consequences. Experienced German aces, who had once dominated the skies, found themselves increasingly vulnerable. Among them was Hans Philipp, a highly decorated pilot whose death in late 1943 symbolized a turning point. The Luftwaffe began to lose not just aircraft, but irreplaceable experience. Investigations were launched to understand this new threat. The conclusion was troubling. The P-47 was not just another Allied fighter. It was something fundamentally different. By 1944, further improvements to the aircraft began to eliminate many of its earlier weaknesses. New variants of the P-47D were equipped with paddle blade propellers, significantly improving climb rate and acceleration. These changes enhanced the aircraft's already formidable performance, making it more competitive even in situations where it had previously struggled. German pilots began to notice the difference. The Thunderbolts they encountered now were faster, more responsive, and just as durable as before. Some even gave it a new nickname, Donnerschlag, thunderclap. The sound of its engine became associated with sudden, overwhelming attacks, and increasingly with death. At the same time, the introduction of drop tanks extended the P-47's range, allowing it to escort bombers deep into Germany. This had profound strategic implications. No longer could German fighters wait for the escorts to turn back. They were now forced to confront them throughout the mission. This created a dilemma: engage the bombers and risk interception by P-47s, or avoid the escorts and allow the bombers to reach their targets unopposed. Either choice came at a cost. Losses mounted. The Luftwaffe, already strained by years of combat, began to falter. Fuel shortages began to cripple training programs. Replacement pilots arrived at the front with only a fraction of the experience their predecessors had possessed. Meanwhile, Allied pilots rotated through structured training pipelines, gaining both flight hours and tactical instruction before entering combat. And then came the next evolution. The P-47 was transformed into a fighter bomber. Equipped with bombs and rockets, it became a devastating tool for ground attack. Its durability allowed it to operate at low altitudes, absorbing anti-aircraft fire that would have destroyed other aircraft. It attacked trains, vehicles, supply lines, anything that moved. Rail networks were severed. Convoys were ambushed from the sky. Entire columns of vehicles could be halted or destroyed within minutes. Bridges became targets, supply depots erupted in flames, and communication lines were systematically cut. German troops on the ground quickly learned to fear it. The sound of its approach meant destruction. Some described the experience as being hunted by something they could not fight back against. Anti-aircraft fire offered limited protection. Camouflage became less effective as Allied air reconnaissance improved. By the time of the Normandy invasion in June 1944, the skies over Western Europe were dominated by Allied aircraft, and the P-47 was at the forefront. Hundreds of Thunderbolts operated over the battlefield, providing constant air, cover, and striking German positions. Attempts by the Luftwaffe to intervene were largely ineffective. They were outnumbered, outperformed, and increasingly outmatched. On the ground, German forces faced a new reality. Movement during daylight became dangerous. Supply lines were disrupted. Reinforcements were destroyed before they could reach the front. The Thunderbolt had become more than a fighter. It was an instrument of control over the battlefield itself. Behind all of this was something even more powerful than the aircraft itself: industry. The United States produced thousands of P-47s, supported by an immense network of factories, workers, and logistics. Assembly lines operated continuously. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, contributing to production at every level. The scale was staggering. Aircraft were not just built, they were replaced, improved, and deployed faster than the enemy could respond. Raw materials flowed from across the American continent. Oil from Texas, aluminum from vast industrial plants, rubber from global supply chains, all converged into a system designed for sustained war. The P-47 was not just an aircraft. It was the product of an entire industrial civilization mobilized for conflict. Pilots were trained in large numbers, with systems in place to replace losses. The Luftwaffe could not match this. Experienced pilots, once lost, could not be replaced. Fuel shortages limited training. Production struggled under constant bombing. The war became one of attrition, and in that war, the Thunderbolt was perfectly suited. By 1945, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Desperate measures, such as Operation Bodenplatte, failed to reverse the situation. Even the introduction of advanced aircraft like the Me-262 could not change the outcome. The P-47 continued to operate, adapting to new threats, maintaining pressure. It escorted, attacked, and dominated. It had outlasted its critics, and it had outlived its enemies. In April 1943, German pilots laughed at the sight of the P-47 Thunderbolt. They saw a machine that defied their expectations of what a fighter should be. Too large, too heavy, too inelegant. In a war where agility and precision had defined success, the Thunderbolt seemed like an anomaly. But war has a way of revealing deeper truths. By 1945, the laughter was gone. In its place was silence, or in some cases, quiet acknowledgement. Post-war accounts from German pilots often spoke not with mockery, but with respect. They described an aircraft that was nearly impossible to bring down, one that could absorb punishment and keep fighting, one that appeared suddenly and struck with overwhelming force. The transformation was complete. The flying milk bottle had become one of the most feared aircraft in the European theater. Its success was not based on elegance or finesse. It did not outturn its enemies. It did not rely on the delicate balance of aerodynamic perfection. Instead, it embodied a different philosophy: power over precision, durability over fragility, and above all, the ability to keep fighting when others could not. In many ways, the story of the P-47 is the story of the war itself. A conflict where tactical brilliance and individual skill were ultimately overshadowed by industrial capacity and sustained pressure, where the ability to produce, to adapt, and to endure proved more decisive than any single maneuver or innovation. The Thunderbolt was not just a fighter. It was a system, a product of factories, engineers, logistics, and the relentless momentum of a nation at war. And in the end, it helped ensure that the skies over Europe were no longer contested, but controlled. So, as we look back on that moment in April 1943, when German pilots first laughed at the sight of this strange, bulky aircraft, we are reminded of how quickly perceptions can change in war, how underestimation can become fatal, and how sometimes the most unlikely designs can reshape the course of history. What do you think? Could the Luftwaffe have adapted in time to counter the Thunderbolt, or was the outcome already inevitable once industrial power entered the equation? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like it. It really helps the channel. Subscribe for more in-depth historical documentaries, and don't forget to enable notifications so you never miss a new release. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.